So when the Soviet Union made the decision to get out of Afghanistan, you didn't have all the nations of the world wringing their hands like, oh, we need to give the Russians an off-ramp. They just made the decision to leave because they don't have to worry a whole lot about public opinion. Yes, there were the mothers complaining about their sons being killed in Afghanistan, but that's different from a leader of a democratic country having to worry about what millions of people actually think. So an autocrat can always just say, all right, I'm changing my mind, I'm changing the narrative. And I think this is what could happen. I don't think the loss of Crimea equals collapse of Putin's regime.
In a recent interview, Ben Hodges, the former U.S. Army commander in Europe, emphasized the importance of liberating Crimea from Russian control. He argued that leaving Crimea in Russia's hand would lead to continued suffering for the local population and pose a constant threat to Ukraine and the region. Hodges stated that there can be no security or freedom of maritime navigation without a liberated Crimea, as Russia has been using the occupied peninsula as a military base, causing disruptions to sea lanes and posing risks to military and commercial movements in the region. The annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014 had significant global security implications. It allowed Putin to strengthen his support among the Russian population, consolidate power, and test the West's readiness to protect its values for political and economic reasons. The weak response from the international community to the seizure of Crimea emboldened Putin and potentially led to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The legitimacy of Russia's claim that 97% of the Crimean population voted in favor of joining Russia in the 2014 referendum has been widely disputed. A leaked report from the Russian president's own Council for Civil Society and Human Rights indicated an estimated turnout of 30%, with just over half voting for rule by Moscow. Crimean Tatar leaders called for a boycott, arguing that the results were predetermined. Since the annexation, Russia has been accused of gross human rights violations and alleged war crimes in Crimea, targeting activists, human rights defenders, journalists, and lawyers. There are over 150 Crimean political prisoners in occupied Crimea and Russia, and many Ukrainians from the newly occupied territories are being arbitrarily detained in Crimea. The liberation of Crimea would not only provide a significant boost for Ukraine and its people, but it would also benefit NATO. Russia's military presence in the Black Sea Fleet has steadily increased, and evicting them from the peninsula would be advantageous for NATO's security interests. The liberation of Crimea would weaken Russia's colonial project, making it the sole loser in this scenario. It's worth listening to General Hodges' take on the issue. Let's dive in.
What I would hope to see is the payoff of training that's been done by the British Army, the U.S. Army, and other allies to help Ukrainian forces conduct a combined arms attack where you integrate tanks, mechanized infantry, engineers that are moving in armored vehicles that will clear paths through the lanes to breach through obstacles, or you've got artillery that is pouring fire down on top of the defenders along this narrow frontage along which they'll attempt to achieve a penetration. And they'll also bring forward some air defense with them, short-range air defense, to help keep away the Russian drones and other responses that the Russians will do. So I would imagine there will be 2 or 3 penetration efforts, and then probably 1 or 2 that are decoys or deception or supporting attacks, so that the Russians can't fix exactly where this is all going to happen. I believe that the potential is there for them to be very successful. That there's this saying, if you're not well trained and disciplined and confident, and you hear that the enemy has bypassed you or they're behind you, you panic. Russian defenders will break, because I don't think in most of these trench lines that the soldiers that are there sitting in those trenches and bunkers are well trained, confident, disciplined, and so the potential for this thing cracking open is very real. Of course, we know that war, the nature of war is unchanging. It's violent, it's uncertain, there's friction, there's fog. So things could go wrong in some places. The only hope that the Kremlin has is for the West to lose interest or to get tired or to get distracted by something else. That's the only thing he can do. There is no other thing they can do to bring about a successful conclusion from a Russian perspective. And you're right. Of course, they know exactly when the American elections are, British elections are, Polish, and on and on and on. Fortunately, the U.S. election is 18 months away. Fortunately, the U.S. Congress continues to support this effort in a very, very strong bipartisan way. Stand fast, there are 3 or 4 loudmouths on both extremes, but by and large, the Congress is in strong support. So I think if my president, and I have not only great respect for my president, but also he's done a good job. And you got 50 nations sticking together, not just NATO nations, continuing to support Ukraine, but he has stopped short of saying exactly what the desired strategic outcome should be. And he also has stopped short of saying we want Ukraine to win. Instead, we say things like we're with you for as long as it takes. That's not something solid enough to generate the kind of support that's needed to bring about a rapid conclusion. If he were to say we want Ukraine to win, and then Prime Minister would say it, Bundeskanzler would say it, and this whole thing would be over by the end of the year. I mean, because then we would stop coming up with excuses why we can't provide ATACMS or we can't provide F-16. If the United States and UK can be stopped from doing what needs to be done when any country threatens to use a tactical nuclear weapon, that's a signal to everybody else in the world that has a nuke or wants a nuke, like, oh, we want some of that. So I think this is the place where actually we take a cold hard look at this and realize there are 0 positive outcomes for Vladimir Putin if they use a nuclear weapon. 0. And so I think the people around him also realize there are no positive outcomes and that it's so unlikely that they would do it. The quickest way to end this war in a way that we want it is to help Ukraine get it done. Now, I would add this. I think another factor out there is we're not sure what it looks like. Okay, let's say Ukraine does win. What happens? China has signaled that they do not want to see a Russian collapse. I don't know that Russia and China and Russia are these friends without limits. Clearly, there are limits to this. And maybe there is a role for China in some way that gives Russia an exit out of this mess that they have put themselves into. But it cannot be. I personally would never advocate for Russia being able to retain even 1 square meter of Ukrainian sovereign territory, to include Crimea. So far, I think most Americans instinctively feel like, this is Ukraine. It's not a perfect democracy, but they've only been at it for about 30 years. So we've been at it for 250 years, and we're not perfect. So there is a sense of the little guy and Russia. Okay, I don't think there's a lot of sympathy for Russia, except perhaps on some people on Fox News. Having said that, the burden is on the president to explain why this matters. It matters because this is about American security, because our security depends on Europe's security. Our prosperity depends on Europe's prosperity. And all that requires stable, secure Europe. Energy supplies, supply chains, refugee problem is not so great. People stay at home. That's one thing. The second thing, this international rules-based order. I mean, that sounds like a political scientist phrase, but if you unpack it, we're talking about respect for borders, respect for sovereignty. That matters to every American. Respect for freedom of navigation. That's essential for our economy that depends on trade. Respect for human rights. Respect for international agreements. Russia hates all that stuff. It's important for us. It's important for all of our European allies. And China is watching to see, are we really willing to defend those values? That Ukraine liberates Crimea is the decisive terrain of this war. Ukraine will never be safe or secure as long as Russia sits there, even after some sort of terrible negotiated settlement. They'll never be able to rebuild their economy as long as Russia can block all of Ukraine's ports from Crimea. So that's the key. That can be done. I believe that can be done by the end of this summer. After that, the Donbass, I think the Kremlin, there will be a lot less enthusiasm for supporting the so-called separatists out there in Luhansk and Donetsk. Ukrainians will be able to clear that up anyway.